It was early morning, just as the sun began to rise over the quiet neighborhood. The streets were peaceful, with only a few cars passing by and birds chirping in the trees. Most people were still inside their homes, getting ready for the day. But for Darius, the day had already begun. Darius was a hard-working garbage collector. He had been doing this job for years, and he took pride in it. Every morning, he and his coworker, Mike, drove through different neighborhoods, picking up trash and making sure the streets stayed clean. It wasn't the easiest job, but he never complained. He believed that every job had value, and he liked knowing that he was helping keep the community in order. This morning felt like any other. The air was cool, and the sky was painted in soft shades of pink and orange. Darius hummed to himself as he stepped out of the truck, grabbed a trash bin, and emptied it into the back. It was a routine he knew well. Just as he was about to move to the next house, something caught his eye. At the far end of the street, a small figure was running toward him. At first, he couldn't tell who it was, but as the figure got closer, his stomach tightened. It was a little girl, and she was barefoot. She wore only her pajamas, her hair messy as if she had just woken up. But what worried him most was her face. She was crying. Darius immediately put down the trash bin and stepped forward. The girl kept running, her tiny feet slapping against the pavement. She was breathing hard, and tears ran down her cheeks. Darius didn't know what was wrong, but his instincts told him that something was very, very wrong. The girl finally reached him and grabbed onto his uniform, holding on tightly as if she was afraid to let go. She was shaking, and her small hands clung to him like he was her only hope. Hey, what's wrong?" Darius asked gently, kneeling down so he was at her level. His deep voice was calm, but inside, his heart was racing. The girl tried to speak, but she was gasping for breath. She looked behind her, as if she was scared someone was chasing her. Darius followed her gaze but saw nothing, just houses and parked cars. "Please, help me," the girl finally whispered between sobs. Darius frowned. His mind raced with questions. Where were her parents? Why was she outside alone? What had scared her so much? "Okay, sweetheart, you're safe now," he said, trying to reassure her. But even as he spoke, a feeling of unease settled in his chest. Something was very wrong, and he knew he couldn't ignore it. Little did he know, within minutes, this quiet street would turn into the center of a shocking event. Darius looked at the little girl clinging to his uniform. Her tiny hands gripped the fabric tightly, and she was still crying, her body trembling. His heart ached for her. Whatever had scared her must have been serious. He gently placed a hand on her shoulder, trying to calm her down. "Take a deep breath, sweetheart," he said softly. "You're safe with me." The girl hiccuped between sobs, trying to catch her breath. Darius could tell she wanted to speak, but she was struggling. He waited patiently, not wanting to rush her. After a few moments, she finally managed to get some words out. "A man," she gasped. "He's in my house." Darius's body tensed. He felt a chill run down his spine. He leaned in slightly, his voice steady but firm. "What do you mean, honey? What man?" The girl wiped her tear-streaked face and shook her head quickly. "I don't know him," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He came inside. Mommy told me to run. She told me to find help." Darius's chest tightened. His eyes flicked toward the row of houses behind her. His mind raced. Somewhere in one of those houses, this girl's mother was in danger, and a stranger was inside with her. His first instinct was to run toward the house, but he knew he had to be smart. He looked around and spotted his coworker, Mike, a few houses down, still collecting trash. Darius waved at him and called out, "Mike, come here now." Mike, a tall and burly man, immediately jogged over. "What's wrong?" he asked, noticing the frightened child. "Stay with her," Darius said quickly. "Something's wrong at her house." Mike's eyes widened. "You call the cops." "I will," Darius said, already pulling out his phone. He dialed 911 with one hand while looking down at the girl. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Amy," she whispered. "Okay, Amy, listen to me," he said as the call connected. "You're safe now. We're going to help your mommy." The 911 operator answered, and Darius quickly explained the situation. "A little girl just ran to me, crying. She says a man is inside her house, and her mother is still inside. I don't know if it's a robbery or something worse, but we need officers here now." The operator asked for the address, and Darius turned to Amy. "Honey, what's your house number?" She sniffled and pointed. "That one," she said, pointing to a white house with blue shutters. Darius relayed the information to the operator. "Tell the officers to hurry," he added. As soon as he hung up, he crouched beside Amy. "The police are coming, okay? They'll help your mom." Amy nodded, but her eyes were still filled with fear. "What if he hurts her?" she whispered. Darius's jaw tightened. He didn't want to make promises he couldn't keep, but he also couldn't stand by and do nothing. "I won't let that happen," he said firmly. Then, without hesitation, he turned and started walking toward the house. Behind him, Mike called out, "Darius, wait. The cops are on their way." "I'm just gonna check," Darius replied. But deep down, he knew he wouldn't just stand outside and wait. If someone was in there hurting Amy's mom, he had to do something before it was too late. Darius moved toward the house with steady steps, his heart pounding in his chest. The morning air suddenly felt heavier, and every sound around him seemed sharper. The rustling of leaves, the distant hum of a passing car, and even his own breathing. He wasn't a police officer, and he had no weapon, but he couldn't just stand by and wait. A woman was inside that house with a stranger, and she might be in danger. As he neared the front door, he noticed something that made his stomach tighten. The door wasn't just open, it was slightly pushed in, as if someone had entered in a hurry. The sight of it made his instincts scream that something was very wrong. He glanced back at Amy, who was now standing with Mike. The little girl looked terrified, clutching Mike's arm as she watched him. Darius took a deep breath and stepped onto the porch. His hands clenched into fists. He listened carefully but couldn't hear much from inside. The living room was dimly lit, the curtains still drawn. He took another step forward and gently pushed the door open wider. The first thing he noticed was the mess. The coffee table was overturned, papers scattered across the floor. A broken lamp lay near the couch, its shattered pieces glinting in the soft morning light. It looked like a struggle had taken place. Then he heard it, a faint, muffled sound. Darius froze, his ears straining. It was coming from deeper inside the house. A woman's voice. Amy's mother. He took another careful step inside. His pulse raced as he tried to stay quiet. His eyes darted around, scanning the room for any sign of movement. Then he heard it again, a muffled cry, followed by a man's deep, angry whisper. Darius's jaw tightened. He followed the sound, moving toward a hallway that led to the bedrooms. The door at the end of the hall was slightly ajar. The closer he got, the clearer the sounds became. He could hear the woman struggling, her voice barely audible beneath whatever was silencing her. He reached the doorway and peered inside. A man stood in the middle of the room, his back facing Darius. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing dark clothes. In front of him, a woman sat on the floor, her hands trembling as she tried to push him away. Her face was streaked with tears, and her mouth was covered by the man's hand. She looked terrified. Darius felt a surge of anger rush through him. His whole body tensed. He didn't know who this man was, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't supposed to be here, and he wasn't going to let him hurt Amy's mom. Darius wasn't the type to act without thinking, but in that moment, he didn't hesitate. "Hey!" he shouted, his deep voice echoing through the room. The man jerked his head up in surprise. His grip on the woman loosened for just a second, and that was all the opportunity Darius needed. Without thinking, he rushed forward, ready to do whatever it took to stop him. Darius didn't think. He just acted. His body moved before his mind could even process what was happening. He charged forward, his footsteps heavy on the floor. The man turned quickly, his face full of shock. He hadn't expected anyone to come inside. For a split second, he hesitated, but then his expression changed. His eyes narrowed, and his body tensed as if preparing for a fight. Amy's mother took this moment to pull herself away from him. She scrambled backward, gasping for air. Her hands trembled as she pressed them against the floor, trying to push herself up. Darius could see the fear in her eyes, but he could also see something else. Relief. She wasn't alone anymore. The man turned toward Darius, his stance shifting. He looked ready to defend himself, but Darius didn't care. He wasn't going to let this man get away with whatever he was trying to do. "Step away from her," Darius said, his voice deep and firm. His heart was pounding, but he refused to show any fear. The man smirked, as if he wasn't afraid at all. "And who are you supposed to be?" he asked, his tone mocking. "This isn't your business." Darius clenched his fists. His muscles were tight, ready to react if the man tried anything. "She made it my business," he said. "The cops are on their way." At those words, something in the man's face changed. His smirk disappeared. His eyes darted toward the door, as if he was calculating his chances of escaping. He took a step back, his hands twitching at his sides. Darius didn't move. He stayed right where he was, blocking the path between the man and the door. If this guy wanted to leave, he would have to go through him. Amy's mother finally managed to get to her feet. She pressed herself against the wall, her breath still shaky. "Please," she whispered, "just go." The man's eyes flickered between her and Darius. His jaw tightened. Then, suddenly, he lunged. But not at Darius. He turned and ran toward the window instead. Before Darius could react, the man grabbed a chair and swung it toward the glass. The sound of shattering glass exploded through the room as pieces flew everywhere. The man jumped through, landing roughly on the grass outside. Darius rushed to the broken window, watching as the man stumbled but quickly got back up. He took off running toward the street, but he didn't get far. Just as he reached the sidewalk, the sound of sirens filled the air. Police cars came speeding down the road, their lights flashing red and blue. Tires screeched as the vehicles came to a stop, blocking the street from both sides. Several officers jumped out, their hands on their holsters. "Freeze!" one of them shouted. The man stopped in his tracks, looking around in panic. For a second, he seemed to think about running, but he knew he had nowhere to go. Slowly, he raised his hands in surrender. Darius let out a deep breath. He turned back toward Amy's mother, who was still shaking but now crying tears of relief. She clutched her hands together, her chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. "It's over," Darius said softly. Outside, the officers moved in, surrounding the man. Within seconds, they had him in handcuffs. The nightmare was finally coming to an end. Darius stood by the broken window, his breath still heavy. The sound of police officers shouting orders filled the air. He watched as they surrounded the man, their voices firm and commanding. The man hesitated for a second, his hands still raised. Then, with no other option, he let them grab his arms and push him down onto the ground. The clinking sound of handcuffs locking into place echoed in the morning air. Darius let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The man wasn't getting away. Amy's mother, still standing against the wall, placed a shaky hand over her chest. Tears rolled down her face, but this time, they weren't just from fear, they were from relief. Darius turned to her. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice softer now. She nodded quickly, but her body was still trembling. I don't know," she admitted. She covered her face with both hands, trying to steady her breathing. Darius took a step closer but kept a respectful distance. "You're safe now," he assured her. "The cops got him." She lowered her hands and looked at him. For the first time, her eyes weren't filled with terror. Instead, there was gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. "If you hadn't come in when you did." Her voice broke, and she couldn't finish the sentence. Darius didn't need her to. He already knew. Before he could say anything else, heavy footsteps came running through the house. 2 police officers entered, their eyes scanning the room. One of them, a tall man with a serious expression, approached them. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" he asked Amy's mother gently. She shook her head quickly. "No, just scared." The officer nodded. "We're going to need a statement from you." Then he turned to Darius. "And you?" Darius shook his head. "I'm fine." The officer studied him for a moment, then gave him a small nod. "We got here just in time, but from what we heard on the 911 call, you acted fast." He glanced at the broken window, then back at Darius. "You helped save her." Darius shrugged, not really knowing what to say. He wasn't looking for praise. He had just done what felt right. Just then, small footsteps came running across the front yard. "Mommy." "Amy." The little girl ran past the officers, her tiny legs carrying her straight to her mother. She crashed into her, wrapping her arms around her waist. "Mommy, I was so scared," she cried. Amy's mother bent down, hugging her daughter tightly. "Oh, baby," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It's okay. I'm okay." Darius felt a lump in his throat as he watched them. This was why he had stepped in, so this little girl wouldn't lose her mother. One of the officers spoke into his radio, updating the situation. Another officer walked the handcuffed man toward one of the police cars. As he passed by the house, he looked up and locked eyes with Darius for just a second. His face was hard to read. Anger, frustration, maybe even regret, but Darius didn't care. The man had lost. As the officers placed him in the back of the car, Amy's mother turned back to Darius. "I don't even know your name," she said. "Darius," he said simply. She gave him a watery smile. "Thank you, Darius. Thank you for everything." Darius nodded. "Anytime." He glanced outside, where neighbors had gathered, watching everything unfold. It wasn't even noon, but this quiet street had already witnessed something unforgettable. Darius stood near the porch, watching as the police officers worked. The street was no longer quiet. Neighbors had come out of their houses, murmuring among themselves, their faces filled with concern and curiosity. Some held their phones, taking pictures or videos. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cars painted the houses with color, making everything feel unreal. Amy was still holding onto her mother, refusing to let go. The little girl buried her face in her mother's shoulder, her small body still shaking. Amy's mother held her tightly, rubbing her back, whispering soothing words. An officer walked up to Darius. He was a middle-aged man with a kind but serious expression. He pulled out a small notepad and pen. "Sir, can you tell me exactly what happened?" Darius took a deep breath and nodded. "Yeah, I was collecting trash down the street when the little girl ran to me, crying. She told me a man was inside her house and that her mom told her to run for help. I called 911 immediately. When I got here, the front door was open, so I went inside." The officer nodded, taking notes. And then, Darius's jaw tightened as he remembered what he had seen. The house was a mess, like there had been a struggle. "I heard noises from the back room, so I followed them. When I got there, I saw him holding her, covering her mouth so she couldn't scream. I yelled, and he turned to me. That gave her a chance to get away. Then he tried to run but jumped out the window instead." The officer nodded again, scribbling everything down. "You did the right thing," he said. "Most people would have been too scared to act. You might have saved her life." Darius shrugged. "I just did what I had to." The officer looked at him for a moment, then smiled slightly. "Well, I'm glad you were here." Just then, another officer called out, "We got a name on him." Everyone turned toward the police car, where the man sat in the back, his hands cuffed behind him. An officer holding a tablet read off the screen. He's got a record: robbery, breaking and entering. Been in and out of jail. Looks like he was out on parole. Amy's mother gasped, holding Amy even closer. "Oh my God," she whispered. "What if?" She didn't finish, but Darius knew what she was thinking. The officer next to Darius sighed. "Don't worry, ma'am. With this, he won't be getting out anytime soon." Amy peeked up from her mother's shoulder. "He won't come back?" she asked in a small voice. The officer crouched down so he was at her level. "No, sweetie. He's going to jail. He won't hurt you or your mommy ever again." Amy looked at Darius. Her big, teary eyes blinked up at him. "You saved us," she whispered. Darius felt something tighten in his chest. He wasn't used to being called a hero. He just did what felt right. But looking at Amy and her mother, he realized something. He had made a difference. A woman from the crowd stepped forward, holding a phone. "Are you the garbage man who saved them?" she asked excitedly. "People need to hear about this. You're a hero." More murmurs spread through the crowd. Some people nodded in agreement. Others started recording, capturing the moment. Darius shifted uncomfortably. He hadn't done this for attention. But before he could respond, Amy's mother stepped forward. "He is a hero," she said firmly. She turned to him, her eyes full of gratitude. "And I will never forget what he did for us." Darius glanced around at all the people watching. Then finally, he smiled. Maybe, just this once, he didn't mind being called a hero. Darius had never been the center of attention before. He was used to doing his job quietly, picking up trash, greeting people with a nod, and moving on to the next street. But now, he stood in the middle of a crowd, with people looking at him like he was someone special. Neighbors whispered to each other, some still recording on their phones. A few people clapped, and others simply shook their heads in amazement. The police had taken control of the situation, but all eyes were still on Darius. Amy's mother wiped her tears and took a deep breath. She turned to face him again. "I don't even know how to thank you," she said, her voice full of emotion. "If you hadn't been there, I don't know what would have happened." Darius gave a small shrug. "I just did what anyone would do." Amy, still clutching her mother's hand, looked up at him with wide eyes. "Not everyone would do what you did," she said softly. Darius felt a lump in his throat. He didn't know what to say. He had never thought of himself as a hero. He was just a man doing his job, going about his day. But now he realized that sometimes the right person was in the right place at the right time. A police officer walked over and patted Darius on the back. "We need more people like you in this world," he said. "If you're ever thinking about joining law enforcement, I think you'd make a great officer." Darius chuckled. "I think I'll stick to my route," he said. "But thanks." The officer smiled and nodded before walking away to speak with his team. The man who had broken into the house was now being placed into the back of a police car. As the door shut, Amy flinched slightly, but her mother squeezed her hand, reassuring her that it was over. The car pulled away, the officers ready to take him to the station. More reporters and journalists had started arriving, eager to cover the story. A woman with a microphone stepped forward. "Excuse me, sir," she said to Darius. "Would you mind answering a few questions? People are calling you a hero." Darius hesitated. He wasn't sure he wanted all this attention. But before he could respond, Amy's mother stepped in. "I'd love to say something," she said, her voice steady. She turned to face the cameras. "This man didn't have to step in. He didn't have to risk himself to save me. But he did." She looked at Darius, her eyes filled with gratitude. "He's more than a garbage man. He's a good man, and I will never forget what he did for me and my daughter." The reporter turned back to Darius. "Do you have anything to say?" Darius scratched the back of his head. He wasn't used to speaking in front of so many people. Finally, he said, "I just did what was right. That's all." The reporter smiled. "Well, The world needs more people who do what's right. Amy suddenly let go of her mother's hand and ran up to Darius. Without hesitation, she wrapped her arms around his waist and hugged him tightly. Darius looked down, surprised, but then gently placed a hand on her back. "Thank you," she whispered. Darius swallowed hard. He had never expected any of this when he woke up that morning. He had just been doing his job. But now, standing here, surrounded by people who saw him as something more, he realized that sometimes small moments could change lives. And maybe, just maybe, this moment had changed his too. As the police cars drove away and the flashing lights faded into the distance, the crowd outside Amy's house slowly began to break apart. Neighbors whispered to one another, shaking their heads in disbelief. Some still had their phones out, recording the last moments of the scene. The news reporters packed up their equipment, ready to spread the story to the world. But Darius wasn't thinking about any of that. His eyes were on Amy and her mother. Amy was still holding onto his hand, her small fingers wrapped tightly around his. She looked up at him with admiration, her eyes no longer filled with fear. Her mother stood beside her, wiping the last of her tears, a deep sense of relief washing over her face. "You don't have to stay," she said softly, looking at Darius. "You've already done more than enough." Darius shook his head with a small smile. "I just wanted to make sure you two were really okay." Amy's mother took a deep breath and nodded. "We are now." Just then, an older woman rushed up the driveway. She looked frantic, her eyes darting between Amy and her mother. "Oh my God, I came as fast as I could," she gasped, bending down to hug Amy tightly. "Grandma," Amy cried, hugging her back. The woman pulled away and turned to Amy's mother. "I got your message. I came as soon as I heard. Are you okay?" Amy's mother nodded, though her hands still trembled slightly. "It was awful, Mom. But Darius was here. He saved us." The older woman turned to Darius, her expression shifting from worry to gratitude. She stepped forward and took his hand in both of hers. "Thank you," she said, her voice full of emotion. "I don't even know how to thank you properly. You protected my daughter and granddaughter. That means everything to me." Darius gave a small nod. "I'm just glad they're safe." Amy's grandmother shook her head. "No, it's more than that. You were there when they needed someone the most." She squeezed his hands before letting go. A few more neighbors came forward, offering their thanks. Some clapped him on the back. Others simply nodded with respect. It was overwhelming, but in a good way. Darius wasn't used to attention. He spent most of his days working quietly, unnoticed by the people whose trash he picked up. But today, people saw him, not as just a garbage man, but as someone who made a difference. Amy's mother reached into her pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper. "I don't want this to be the last time we talk," she said, handing it to him. "If you ever need anything, or if you just want to stop by and say hi, call me." Darius hesitated for a moment, then took the paper with a nod. Amy let go of his hand and stepped back. But before she did, she gave him one last look. "You're my hero," she whispered. Those words hit Darius harder than anything else that had happened that day. He smiled. "You're a strong girl, Amy. You don't need a hero, but I'll always be around if you do." Amy grinned, and for the first time that day, she looked happy, really happy. Darius finally stepped back, giving them one last nod before heading down the street. His garbage truck was still parked a few houses away, waiting for him to finish his route. He climbed into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel for a moment as he took everything in. His life hadn't changed. Tomorrow, he would still wake up early, put on his uniform, and drive through the same neighborhoods. He would still pick up trash and wave at people who barely noticed him. But today, he had made a difference. Today, he had been more than just the garbage man. As he started the truck and pulled away, he glanced in the rearview mirror. Amy and her mother stood outside their house, watching him go, their faces full of gratitude. And for the first time in a long time, Darius felt truly seen.